Everybody. Thank you for coming for CEIMIA's first webinar in a series of 3 on AI interoperability. So by way of introduction, CEIMIA is a nonprofit organization based in Montreal, Canada, that mobilizes expertise and resources to promote the development and responsible use of AI for the benefit of humanity. This work is done through innovative, socially responsible, and high-impact applied projects in AI, such as this project, conducted with the support of Google.org on AI and interoperability. Over the next 90 minutes or so, you'll be hearing presentations from our 3 panelists on the state of AI governance and the growing need for technical and regulatory interoperability. Following these presentations, we'll have a discussion around their overarching themes and a Q&A with the audience to end things off. So today's panelists are Monique, who is the Executive Director of the Schwartz-Reisman Institute at the University of Toronto, where she leads their strategy, operations, and partnerships, addressing the social impacts of advanced technologies such as AI. With a diverse background in technological innovation and strategic leadership, she has previously served as the Director of Strategic Engagement and Partnerships at Indoc Research and as the Director of Strategic Initiatives and Partnerships at Compute Ontario. Next, we have Alyssa, who's the Director of AI Trust and Safety at the Alberta Machine Intelligence Institute, or AIMI, a leading Canadian AI research hub, where she champions responsible AI for promoting safe and beneficial deployment, public trust, and strong governance. Alyssa is supporting AIMI's involvement with the Canadian AI Safety Institute, which is a national initiative addressing risks and promoting trustworthy AI. She provides strategic guidance and collaborates globally to advance AI safety. And lastly, we have Marta, who is the National Standards Officer at Microsoft Ireland, based in Dublin. She has been a leader in AI standards since 2016, having participated in a number of international, regional, and consortia standards. Marta was the project lead for the development of ISO/IEC 40001, and is currently their convener for their working group on foundational standards. Marta has professional experience in both public and private sectors, working on collaborating in multinational settings with diverse stakeholders, having lived and worked in numerous countries. So during these presentations, please feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A chat, and we'll answer as many as we can after the presentation and discussion. But to start, we'll be hearing from Monique. Feel free to take it away.
Thank you, Benjamin, and thank you to the team at CEIMIA for organizing today's event. As Benjamin has noted, my name is Monique Critchlow, and I'm the Executive Director at the Schwartz-Reisman Institute at the University of Toronto. The Schwartz-Reisman Institute is an interdisciplinary research institute that focuses on how advanced technologies are developed and deployed in socially beneficial ways. Artificial intelligence happens to be one of them. We have over 100 researchers affiliated with our institute, and our unit helps to ensure that fundamental research is happening, but also the knowledge translation work that helps practitioners and decision makers understand the impacts of AI in as near as real time as possible. So participating in today's event is one of the ways in which we can help to do that. I just wanted to briefly start by kind of talking about some of the work that we do, particularly in the realm of governance and regulation. A lot of the times folks talk about regulation and they think about hard law, but I'd like to invite people to think about regulation broadly today. One way that we know that we can use regulation is to implement some of our normative goals through society. So we should really be thinking about regulation as a systematic process by which rules, standards, guidelines are established and enforced to govern or incentivize behaviors of individuals, organizations, or systems within a specific domain. So if we think about this definition of regulation, it actually is quite broad because it's our normative aspirations. It's the rules, standards, guidelines that we establish, the people, the institutions, and their interactions that we're trying to create, a set of activities around that guide behaviors in a particular direction that we see as beneficial. The example that I like to give folks, just because I come from healthcare, is in hospitals. So when we go into our hospitals, I think everybody has the expectation that they'll receive quality care and that they'll go in and have a relatively safe and risk-free experience. We also know that hospitals are places where people, when they're ill, go, when they need surgeries, when they need rehabilitative care. So the folks that are going into hospitals are often in conditions that require that they be treated with extra care because they're already at risk. So some of the things that we would expect in a hospital is hand washing. So that's just a normative expectation. We expect that our healthcare providers will wash their hands before they see us. But we also, thinking about that care interaction, can recognize that the healthcare practitioner that's seeing us, whether if it's a physician, has likely taken something called a Hippocratic oath, which kind of demonstrates that their willingness to kind of do no harm. And we hear that all the time. So they're going to do their best from an ethical standpoint to interact with you in a way that is appropriate. We know that health professionals are regulated by colleges and bodies, and the drugs that they might administer are also regulated. And the hospital where you might be receiving that care and getting lab work done or x-rays done is also an accredited space. People come in and they check and they verify that um, all of the standards, procedures, and equipment is operating in a way that we expect, so that to minimize the instances of safety and risk. And then we know that some of those devices, medical devices, for example, might be aligned to a specific standard. On top of all of those types of different interactions between norms, codes of conduct, licensing and regulatory bodies, accreditation and standards, what we also have is a set of legal frameworks. So there's tons of pieces of legislation and regulation that also help to ensure that that interaction um, that we are expecting for a safe one occurs. And so I like to use the example of hospitals because I think it shows people how multi-layered and complicated something like a regulatory environment can be, but also helps to ground it in a way that we can all kind of um, understand or interpret, because we've all received care at some point. So I think it's a nice way to ground all of the complexities that come in with making sure that our goal, a safe care interaction, occurs. One of the things that I also like to point out in the is that all of that happens through a set of mechanisms that typically have components of what I like to say is like democratic oversight of principles. Generally, when we build systems of regulation and governance, we rely on governments to set policies. It's pretty top down. We have formal and informal systems like the ones that I mentioned above to help us to decide what is right and what's wrong and how people should be behaving in certain instances. And when they don't, and when those systems and when we interact with those systems and something happens that we think shouldn't have happened, there's usually a mechanism for recourse. And we recognize that the systems that we interact with, customs or traditions, government policies and laws, our courts or our hospitals, tribunals, police, that are all working to enforce those systems, what we ask them to do can change over time. Another example that I like to give folks just to understand how our normative values can change over time and how those systems interact can therefore adapt to that change is like the example of women in work. So, at one point in time, it wasn't socially acceptable for one system of women to work, but now it's totally normal for women to work and be part of the labor force. And we see that represented in all sorts of things in terms of women leaving the home, women being able to open bank accounts, women being able to hold property, and that sort of thing. So we know that these systems, when we set them up, they can be adaptive to um, our normative expectations and our changing social perspectives. So within that context, I'd like to bring it into artificial intelligence now. So in Canada, we made best efforts, I think, to introduce comprehensive or an attempt at comprehensive regulation for artificial intelligence through ADA, the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, which was introduced through Bill C-27. So that was an effort that started in 2022, and most recently, if you've been following, we all know that it died on the floor when Parliament was prorogued earlier this year, and likely won't be refreshed in given the circumstances. But the goal of ADA at the time would have been to catch potential risks and harms that we think might occur from artificial intelligence earlier in the pipeline by focusing on, in particular, the developmental stream. So with that, that means with private industry and the work that they were doing to develop products and bring them to market. So what do we lose with ADA being lost? I like to say that, we lose that opportunity for early intervention, but it doesn't mean that all regulatory mechanisms that we rely on have been lost. We still have a number of bodies like regulatory bodies, courts, and systems and laws that help to protect us every day in our interactions. So consumer protection laws, privacy laws, these things still exist and they still operate, particularly in the regional level in Ontario where I live. Um, there was a bill that was just introduced. It was Ontario had Bill 194, and that was a piece of legislation that actually focused on the public sector. So, so that was a difference between ADA. ADA focused on the private sector. Bill 194 focuses on the broader public sector. And when you think about the broader public sector at the regional or provincial level, you're usually looking at services like hospitals, education, and policing. So places where our interactions with AI in our daily lives are more likely to occur on a regular instance. And so I think there's a great opportunity right now in Canada, in particular at the regional level, for folks to be thinking about how they'd like to govern and to potentially regulate artificial intelligence. We do see things like regulatory bodies like um, the Office of the Superintendent for Financial Services. They have the E23 model risk guidance that they developed over the last 2 years. We've seen things like the Law Society of Ontario issuing guidance to practitioners on how to use generative AI in their practices. And even in the government level, Treasury Board is in the process of updating their directive. So I say that all to say that even though we have we've lost an opportunity with ADA, it doesn't mean that we're void of any regulatory mechanisms or oversight mechanisms. Um, Also, when ADA was introduced, we also saw something called the Voluntary Code of Conduct and Responsible Development and Management of Advanced Generative AI Systems. And this was a voluntary code that allowed companies to sign on to say that they would accept that they would make best efforts to develop AI in a way that was accountable and safe. And there was a number of criteria. It's still available on ISED's website if folks are interested in checking it out. And this is another way that we can help to ensure that there is expectations or some sort of um, regular or behavior or consensus building of behavior developing in an ecosystem. So it's separate from hard law, but voluntary codes still have a lot of potential. And so the example that I like to give folks is in this instance, that's not related to AI, is through a credit card payment. So if we think back a few decades ago, major credit card services created the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standards Council. And that's where they created all of their standards for data protection, fraud prevention, which help, and all the members who were part of that council adhere to that. And this was notable because in the US, there was actually no federal data protection law that would apply to credit card companies. But through these standards, there was an expectation that was set around data protection and fraud prevention. And those types of mechanisms where we see industry coming together to develop things can help to promote things like co-regulation. And I won't get into the pros and cons of that, but other than to say that I think what we do see today happening in artificial intelligence and its governance and its alignment with our normative expectations is that there is an opportunity for industry to participate. We do see industry developing responsible scaling protocols and sharing information about those protocols. And I think we should be optimistic about that behavior and trying to look for ways to ensure that the discourse that's happening in those spaces continue to enter into mainstream policy conversations about how do we develop and provide oversight of AI systems in a way that is socially beneficial. The last thing that I will kind of touch on as well is this idea of products in the marketplace and creating incentives for market-based incentives for ensuring that AI products are developed in a safe and responsible way. And this also is, and again, another type of form of governance and oversight that we can rely on. So when we think about things like the assurance ecosystem, how can we ensure that there are um, products that are being developed, standards being developed, auditors that are compliant, certifying bodies, and other sorts of actors that are aligning to a set of expectations and outcomes. And so one of the pieces of work that I like to point to was done by Gillian Hatfield, who was the former director of the Schwartz-Reisman Institute, and she had this idea called regulatory markets, and it's really about this idea of creating competition around regulation. So you still have the government setting have with oversight and setting the expectations around outcomes, but then you have a community of practitioners, whether they're auditors or insurance companies or infrastructure providers, who are now competing to create and align incentives in a way that creates options for what we consider to be um, safe or responsible instances of AI development, deployment, auditing, risk management. And together, this ecosystem, by creating those incentives, helps to drive people towards, the acceptance of better process, because you're now competing for services of others to deliver those things, and the outcome has been set. So that's another model I think that is actually really promising at this time when we think about kind of AI standards and market-based mechanisms for addressing our expectations, our normative expectations around AI, particularly in the instance where we don't have comprehensive regulation. Having the ability to say to have for a government like the provincial government of Ontario to say, I want to buy a service that looks like this, and have the ability to choose between company A and company B that have clearly articulated what their position is on whether it's their computing environment or their standards that they're building into their product, helps to ensure that there's things like transparency, accountability. But like I said, the competition also makes sure that also will help with, kind of level setting and raising the bar for others. Because if you want to attract those services, you're going to at least have to participate in some sort of mechanism that demonstrates that you're trying to adhere to some sort of coverage around this. I think it also helps to clarify roles and responsibilities and expectations for folks. And we're seeing this increase in other parts of AI. I think the fair trade movement, which I won't get into, is a great example of organizing and certifying. And we've seen people trying to take this model and apply it to artificial intelligence as well. So in sum, I would say that governance and regulation of artificial intelligence is pretty broad as a topic. It includes all of the policy interventions that we expect our governments to take, but also the institutions, people, standards, rules, and expectations, and their interactions together, and trying to create a set of incentives that align people towards a particular behavior. So those could be positive or punitive. And I think I've laid out a couple examples of how that's been developing in other instances and in Ontario. Um, and most notably, if I want folks to take away from my talk, it would be that legislation, while it's an important piece of the puzzle, it's having a specific bill on artificial intelligence doesn't prevent us from ensuring that there is a set of expectations that are laid out for AI developers, and a set of expectations and guarantees that we can expect as consumers of products, and that we still have other mechanisms for protection. And really, the goal ought to be thinking about how we can ensure that those incentives, the policy incentives, the existing legislative frameworks, line up with those other activities. There will likely be instances of gaps in current legislation as products mature and AI matures, and I think that that's an opportunity for us to think about either modernization of existing laws or the reintroduction of AI specific regulation. But I think that like the critical message is that we are not void of any sort of protection because just simply because ADA failed.
Thank you. A lot of the points at the end there segue nicely into what I think Melissa is going to talk about the various mechanisms to sort of address these things. So, Melissa, feel free to start whenever you're ready.
Yes, thank you, Monique, for teeing me up really nicely from some of the things I'm going to talk about. So thanks for the introduction. Thanks for having me. It's a privilege to be here with Monique, Marta, Ben, and the rest of the CEIMIA team. So I'm Alyssa Lefebvre-Scopus. I joined as the Director of AI Trust and Safety at AIMI at the beginning of January during a very slow and completely clear time in the AI landscape. But just in case those that don't know AIMI is one of the 3 research institutes in Canada as part of the Pan-Canadian AI strategy, along with our partners Vector and Mila. So a few things that AIMI does, just for your awareness, is we conduct cutting edge research in AI and ML with our partners at the University of Alberta. We provide training and education programs and literacy around AI and AI governance across a whole spectrum of topics, including with K-12 students as we kind of think about the future of our workforce. And we work with businesses and organizations to help them bring AI into their companies or to spin off and build new companies where AI is the focus, but focus for AI for good and for society and humanity. So I'm excited to talk about this and kind of take a step back slightly around talking about incentives as Monique teed up, but trust more generally and how that relates to interoperability. I couldn't agree with Monique more that regulation seems like maybe the obvious lever to pull when it looks like trying to manage AI and some of the risks, but there's a lot going on here and there's a whole landscape that needs to be considered. So I'm just going to double click on some of the things that Monique mentioned. But kind of ultimately, when I think about my role, people are like, what is trust and safety? I'm like, that's a very good question. It's very broad and ambiguous, but I think it's important to think about, why does trust even matter? Like, why do we care about AI trust in general? And why does, regulating it or managing it with soft law approaches, why is that important? And so in a variety of studies, and after I'm done talking, I'll kind of put some links in the chat, but it is true that Canada doesn't have a high degree of trust in AI solutions. And we are one of the countries that are kind of lagging in adoption as well. In an Edelman Trust Barometer, it ranks Canada 6th from the bottom of the countries polled in terms of trust in AI. This is probably to be expected considering the rapid pace and how things have developed, but the impact of this is that we're not also going to see the other side of the equation, which are the enormous benefits that can be had from AI. And so, part of interoperability and part of I became blind. I can't see my notes. That happened overnight. But when I think about interoperability and global cooperation more generally, you kind of do need a baseline of trust in the technology, or at least an understanding of how to get there. So as ambiguous and fluffy as the word trust might be, we need to ask ourselves these questions of, do we trust this technology? Do we trust the people building it? Are we confident with the systems and structures in place around the people governing it? And are they doing it in our best interests? And do we trust our own ability to understand it and engage with it? And some of these questions may not have answers, or we may be on a spectrum of getting there. And so thinking about how we consider and engage with this technology and how it relates to interoperability and incentives is a really important piece of the puzzle. And so it's kind of clear to me, based on kind of the way that Canadians, and not just Canadians, but others interact with AI, that we do need mechanisms to increase trust. And as Monique mentioned, and as I'll kind of click on, there are other levers to consider other than regulation. Given what we're seeing coming from a variety of countries, and especially after the Paris AI Action Summit, it is unlikely that we're going to see a revival of ADA anytime soon in its current form. We're also unlikely to see much regulation happening at the country level, other than from the EU AI Act, which I know Marta will speak to a little bit more, but probably not coming out of the US, likely not coming out of the UK. So we really need to focus on those other levers for interoperability and think about the incentives for those things. And I'm going to kind of talk about a few of them. And we can talk about more of them during the Q&A as well. So the first thing I want to talk about was kind of safety institutes generally and the landscape of safety research. So for those that haven't seen it or haven't had a chance to read all 300 pages, just before the AI Action Summit at the beginning of February, the International AI Scientific Safety Report was launched. It was written by 100 AI experts and included representatives nominated by 33 countries and intergovernmental organizations. The reason this was really important is because the report didn't agree on everything. This is still some of the topics around AI trust and safety, how to manage it, and the risks are up for debate. And that's okay, because the fact that there is no consensus doesn't mean that there's no progress. And so the fact that there was representatives from a variety of different countries, including China, to look at the AI risks and how to mitigate them. While it's not regulation, it is a goal to try and understand globally the types of risks and understand how they can be ranked, how they can be considered, and what the priority for research should be. So that's one really important mechanism and kind of collaboration internationally. The second one I want to point to is the International Network of AI Safety Institutes. Ben alluded to this in the introduction, but Canada in November launched the Canadian AI Safety Institute. And, with the objective of working with the other international safety institutes in Australia, the EU, France, Japan, Kenya, Korea, Singapore, the UK, and the US to understand what the safety risks are and the mitigations based on kind of shared values. And literally in the press release for this International Network of Safety Institutes says, support international development and the adoption of interoperable principles and best practices. So really, really trying to not duplicate efforts, maximize on the research capacity and expertise of those different safety institutes, and to collaborate on areas where there's potentially, context or cultural specific things around language and things like that need to be considered from a global perspective. The other thing we're also seeing is things coming out of the OECD. So again, at the Action Summit, they launched the first global framework for companies to report on their efforts to promote safe, secure, and trustworthy AI based on the Hiroshima Protocol and the Hiroshima process with the G7. And so there's this sort of global research piece happening, but also these intergovernmental organizations that are working to create a bridge between a variety of countries to understand how AI risks are understood, managed, and then how opportunities can be maximized. I'm going to take a sip of water because I'm getting over a cold. Thank you. So the next thing I'll kind of talk to, and you heard the bios, so I'm going to defer a lot of this to Marta because she's clearly very much an expert in standards and standardization. But I've kind of been learning about standards over the last few years and getting really nerdy about them because they're one of the most important pieces, I think, in terms of creating interoperability globally and nationally. So for those that aren't kind of into the standard space, and I'm certainly not an expert, but there are a variety of standards happening with ISO and others that are focusing on creating guidelines and guidance, usually in a voluntary mechanism for companies trying to deploy AI. So ISO 42001 is like the big one, and it's the AI management system standard for organizations to help them in a structured way manage risks. And then there's a whole bunch that are under development, including 42,005, which is impact assessments, 42,006, which is really important for those that are going to be evaluating compliance or alignment with 42,001. There's other standards that help people understand the risks, including ISO 23894. Like I said, Marta's the expert here, but The things that are really important about standards is they're typically developed globally, meaning that there are voices across a variety of countries and stakeholders to develop them. So they are from the outset designed to promote interoperability. They really aim to reduce technical barriers and bridge different regulatory environments. I wouldn't call the development of standards fast, but I would say that they can potentially react with more agility than law and regulation. And there's a clear systematic process in how they're developed. We've also seen that it works. We've seen that standards have worked in telco. We've seen standards work when we're thinking about selling toys from China to other markets. And there's a lot of incentive there. We want things that are safe and healthy. We want things that work for our economies. And we want things that allow us to collaborate and kind of sell goods and have strong market access on a global level. So I'll defer some of the expertise of standards to Marta, but want to point to it as one important lever and a soft law approach that helps with interoperability. This is a really important one, and I think touches on what Monique said at the end around kind of market influences or market ways in which people can kind of move the needle in terms of responsible AI adoption and development, and that's procurement. It's no longer in existence, but the executive order with Biden in the US was a really strong way that the US government was going to pay attention to how they were building and procuring AI systems that kind of follow some guidelines and best practices that they had aligned to. So governments and large multinationals can really leverage their buying power in terms of creating an environment where they have requirements for the tools and products they're building and acquiring. The company has a strong incentive to protect themselves from risk and also to buy the best products available on the market. And depending on the organization, they may also kind of align to the highest level of standard across the different countries, despite the potential regulatory differences. And so we see a lot of this risk mitigation in large companies trying to make sure that the tools they're buying and building are aligned to the things that protect them. But then we also see the companies that want to sell into government, into large multinationals, meeting the need and kind of developing their own governance processes to make sure that they're competitive in that landscape. The only caveat I'll add, and I think is really important, is that it is important for balance here. One of the things that does concern me is making the barrier to entry too high that only the largest and best finances companies can compete in this environment. And so thinking about what the right balance is for, what the right balance is for the types of requirements and the timeline to meet those requirements when acquiring tools so that we don't shut out startups and small, medium enterprises when they're trying to compete in this global market. The last thing I kind of really want to talk about, and it's on a slightly higher level, is just around literacy in general. So thinking about interoperability and thinking about being able to engage in these conversations, it's really important to think about the types of skills and the types of understanding that need to be at the table and that we need to have represented in the conversation. And the truth is we need a little bit of everyone. The scientific report is an excellent example of the technical expertise coming together. The working groups that develop standards are really important that also need that technical expertise. We need economists that understand different markets, understanding how potential trade opportunities might work, and more. And it's really also important that you have those people that know a little bit of everything as well to be able to connect the dots to all these different levers and incentives. And so when I think about, in the absence of harmonized regulations, in an ambiguous and sort of intense geopolitical environment, the things that can really make a difference are, scientific collaboration, international safety institutes, standards and standardization, and then, thinking about the market incentives and the market structures with procurement and organizations who want to compete competitively, but also want to reduce risk and maximize the benefit of the AI tools they're adopting. These are all things we can start to consider from an interoperability perspective. So I'll pause there. I'm looking forward to the Q&A, and I'll hand it back to Ben. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for bringing up standards in line with what Monique was talking about. And I think that sets it up well for what Marta's going to talk about, which I think is primarily the standardization of AI. Marta, feel free to take it away.
Thank you, and apologies in advance. I've been suffering from a not tech day, so hopefully I don't get dropped, but I will remain off video just for safety's sake. But thank you, and thank you very much for being able to let me join and join the conversation. It's been great to hear different viewpoints. As Ben mentioned in the introduction, I'm currently based in Dublin, Ireland. However, I've spent a number of years in Canada working with crown corporations and getting involved and setting up what their AI strategy looks like, as well as helping some of the SMEs to get their Canadian voice in the international landscape. That being said, most of the work that I have done has been through the lens of standards, and most recently now, the intersection between standards and regulation. So I'm happy to touch upon a bit of the EU landscape, in particular, of course, the EU AI Act, and some of the nuances there and how they relate to AI governance, but then also just the relationship from an industry perspective on the types of pillars and intersections that we need to think about when we look at AI governance holistically, and the relationship that we need to continue to foster to be on the marketplace. So with that, a few words on sort of the EU landscape. The EU AI Act has obviously taken the attention of I think most regulators globally, but has been under development in sort of the limelight for the last few years, and it's in its final stretch for implementation. I think we've heard a lot about it being sort of the colloquial term of like first to market, or the first to have these frameworks around safety, fundamental rights when it comes to a digital service and product. What I would like to highlight, I think, that we is really good to keep in perspective is that its role has almost, I would say, sort of three different application levels. And the one that I think we hear about the most is about the way to have protectionism, I guess, around the safety or trust for like high risk systems. That's the majority of the controls that you see, and you see the clauses that come through in the articles. But the other two aspects are how restricted use applications of AI will be treated, as well as what the list definitively of prohibitive use are. And I think that's really interesting because it gives like I think a line in of which AI systems categorize themselves across those three. And of course, that's not static, and it depends very much on time, place, context, and application. But I think that's very interesting to note in terms of the different types of approaches. Of course, this is related to risk management, the level of the impact of deployment, but the fact that the regulation has gone so far as to be able to differentiate between those three different types of levels. From a standardization perspective, it's also been a fascinating time because of the highlight of the possible use of standards as a supplement to the implementation of regulation. And maybe sometimes to the point where it seems like that is the function of standards. For the EU context, there are the ability to harmonize European norms. And harmonize is a European legal mechanism term for incorporated by reference. And so this is where, as part of your implementation and a part of your overall conformity and being able to assure compliance, you can leverage certificates that state that you meet the requirements of a standard as part of your regulatory compliance package. This is an ongoing process, and I think this one has definitely garnered a lot of attention because it has turned into a very functional aspect of how the EU AI Act will work in the years to come. It's also been very different than maybe in past industries that have also leveraged this mechanism. The mechanism itself is not new, but it has been usually not done in tandem with the development of regulation. So very often you already have a regulation and you're able to, over time, as it's played out in practice, be able to match those standards. That being said, we have a chance now to develop this at the same time. And it causes for a possibility closer alignment, but it also causes for a lot more active discussions on interpretation and understanding how the AI Act is going to be used. So with that, I would like to transition now a little bit into how that standards landscape functions today, because of course this is a big aspect of conversation.
Marta? Looks like Marta's technical difficulties are happening again. So maybe while she is going to drop and rejoin, we can take a few of the questions, if that's okay with Alyssa and Monique. Yeah, that works. Okay. So we have one about hospital settings, which I assume is for Monique. So in many hospital settings, decision-making is governed by strict hierarchies rather than democratic processes. And how do you work within these existing structures when designing AI regulations for healthcare, or maybe like in general for other similarly structured industries?
So I think this is true in general healthcare because of its understanding of risk is top down in its creation. So when I reference democratic oversight of hospitals, I'm thinking about things like hospitals exist because the government has set legislation that says that they can operate and sets up the requirements for them to operate. Having said that, it's not that hospitals are devoid without, they're actually very unique in their organizational structure, and I could go on for days, but what I will say is what we tend to see is, you know, expert communities sometimes getting together, and this is speaks to, we've seen this in other areas where you will, maybe you're going to introduce, something into the general medicine ward. So you'll have a group of nurses, technologists, clinicians working together in an interdisciplinary setting to determine what the risks and best path to implementation of something like that is before it's deployed in the system. Even in the hospital system, before they do things like that, depending on what the intervention is, it may require them to go through things like, do even for research perspective to do work, like to go through research board ethics approval. So what I will say is that yes, they are top down heavy. My reference to democratic process was really about governments set the laws that it helps to establish our healthcare facilities in our different provincial regions. But we still see this work that happens where expert communities come together to make shared decisions about how to approach a problem or a care intervention. And so that interdisciplinary connecting of work, I think, is very common in the hospital, and maybe as an example of things that people can use in other settings as well. And I think Alyssa spoke to kind of the importance of that. And I know at Schwartz-Reisman we highly value interdisciplinary perspectives and understanding problems and solving things.
Sorry, Alyssa, did you have anything to add to that question? It's okay if you don't, we can go to the next question. Okay. Next question asks, we sort of mentioned a commitment to democratizing AI, and they were just somebody in the audience was curious. Could we explain how you incorporate normative principles into this approach?
So the one thing that I think we've seen a resurgence in when it comes to democratizing AI is and I didn't talk about this, but the question's asking this, but it could just because I said democratic oversight, is the reintroduction of open source AI and open source tools. And again, with open source tools and open source AI, you start to see a community of practice that builds around them as folks try to find new ways to develop these tools. And I actually think that these are really great mechanisms, particularly for folks that have like a niche or community specific interest with AI development and deployment. But I would say open source is definitely one of the things that we are seeing a resurgence in the AI landscape, and it is an opportunity for folks to have access to information that they may not have been able to have otherwise or develop on their own. And Alyssa's nodding, so maybe she wants to add to that.
I just think open source is a big, I mean, obviously a big piece of this. And then I'm also just thinking about like what democratizing AI even means. It's a really big question. And I think about like, okay, does that include literacy and making sure people have equal access? Does that mean including infrastructure so people can actually have a internet connection so they can access it? Does that mean making sure that all these elements around, are all the benefits that can be captured from AI are extended to the global south, and we're not using labor to, label our data and those types of things. And so, I mean, incorporating normative values and the democratization of AI is a huge, huge piece. I totally agree that open source is a big part of it, and I think it will, benefit more people to have, more access to these tools. But then I also think of like the bigger picture of making sure all of the infrastructure is in place to make sure that people have equal access to the benefits and opportunities, and we're not exploiting populations in, resource tax areas, making sure there's access to data and compute and things like that allow everyone to, for lack of a better word, join the party. So not being able to ask a clarifying question on your question, those are the other elements in addition to definitely open source that I would consider.
So it looks like Marta's back, so we will pick up her presentation. And I think roughly around when she was dropping off, she was going to talk about the AI standards landscape. So Marta, if you're back, feel free to continue on.
Please let me know. Can you hear me all right now?
Yep.
Okay, so let's capitalize on this while it's still here. So yes, what I was going to say from the AI standards landscape is that while there's a big focus on the use of standards to support regulation due to the legal mechanisms available in the European Union, the idea of standards is sort of far more reaching than just a regulatory reference. And I think Alyssa did a great introduction about the baseline for interoperability and the ability to have like a maturation of technology around certain aspects of its domain, but also the ability to have a stacking effect where we already see industries and verticals have extensive safety and risk management frameworks in place specific to their vertical. And this way forward of applying AI standards on top of existing regular sort of industry standards gives that interoperability to then see AI applications not just in a general purpose setting, but also in the vertical and product specific setting. So when we do look at international standards such as ISO and IEC, we have the standard that was mentioned, 40,001, is a great example of this because it leverages a structure that is very familiar to many organizations, both industry, not-for-profit. We saw examples from healthcare and hospitals. The idea of a management system is well documented through standards, through certifications, and its diverse application of like just of basic good governance principles through a list of controls that an organization can implement holistically to be able to then ascertain that its products and services can meet a certain level of quality. And being able to leverage that existing framework and applying it to what it means in an organization that either uses, provides, develops, deploys AI systems is a great sort of functional almost starter for an organization trying to understand how best to approach AI, especially if they're sort of at a crossroads of not really having a lot of questions. Maybe the level of risk appetite is quite low, and this gives that sort of unifying base, and you can plug in different standards. If you're in the healthcare space, if you're in the medical devices space, there are existing standards that are interoperable with each other, which creates a level of a reduction of barrier to those types of applications. And I think particularly from then the industry side of things, when at the end of the day, regulatory is going to guide a lot of the frameworks and the requirements of the landscape, the other aspect of it is the consumer trust of it. And whether it's a direct to consumer or the consumer in this particular case is other organizations, there needs to be a common language to be able to then use that language to build the trust. And in that particular case, standards become extremely useful because you're able to have almost like a shorthand where by referencing a certain standard, and doesn't necessarily need to be international, we see frameworks that have been developed regionally, such as the NIST AI risk management framework. And we've seen others come from some of the safety institutes that are starting to put together frameworks for guidance. Being able to leverage and reference that document is almost like a shorthand in those types of conversations with customers, clients, stakeholders, to be able to very quickly understand what that organization wishes to encompass, and what is the base unit in which they are speaking about their quality, their safety, their approach to governance. So I think that plays a very critical role when we look at the adoption of the technology. One big aspect, of course, is procurement. When we look at public service in various countries all over the world, they have different procurement methods, sometimes different requirements, different conditions that need to be met. But a big part of what they can do is leverage standards as part of their requirements in the procurement. We've seen this be very successful in when looking at procurement of specific products for like safety, for example, or for materials and equipment, where instead of writing each procurement specification by hand, sort of each detail outright, they can say, well, we need to see safety at a minimum in compliance with the following 4 standards. And it makes it a very equal playing field because for those that would like to bid on those procurement contracts, it's very clear what the expectations are. It's very clear how to demonstrate that you either meet them or you don't. And then from a review process, you can very easily verify whether that is actually met and whether that actually meets the needs of the contract details. So there's different aspects towards that type of adoption of standards. And I think in this type of landscape where we do see some jurisdictions like the EU pursuing strongly their regulatory framework, but there are other jurisdictions that are currently really doing an evaluation of what is the benchmark that they are willing to pursue. These types of interactions, I think, are going to play a very strong role in how trust is embedded and how governance is being able to be demonstrated, albeit sometimes on a case-by-case basis, but leading to that maturation of the adoption of technology.
Thank you. Thank you for the overview on standards. So we're gonna go right into the discussion part, and I'd like to ask Marta a couple questions about incorporation by reference, because I think she brought this up a few times, and it goes very well into what Monique and Alyssa talked about. So I'm just sort of curious if you could maybe like briefly describe how incorporation by reference works, and then talk about like how you've seen it kind of play out in other areas, because I know it's currently not happening in AI space, although SentinelX kind of working on it. And then how it can contribute to interoperability efforts.
Sure. So incorporation by reference is the term that's used in Canada for when you incorporate referencing a standard number. So, arbitrarily, if we're going to use the hypothetical setting of ISO/IEC 42001 as part of being able to demonstrate compliance to that particular clause of that particular act. So this comes, and we've seen a number of standards over the years, some of them international, some of them in Canada, for example, Canadian, they're Canadian specific, based on what the department is looking to achieve. So, for example, in the Ministry of Transport, there are a number of standards that are incorporated by reference as a way to ask for certain safety aspects in components, such as, for example, the placement of lights on a vehicle. That's something that, for example, isn't explicitly stated within a regulatory act, but can refer to a specific standard, which then gives you sort of a presumption of conformity to that particular clause. We've seen this in healthcare, in medical devices, especially extensively. Health Canada has leveraged a combination, again, predominantly of international standards to help support the implementation of its Medical Devices Act. And this in particular, I think, is a very interesting example because in this particular case, regulators from Canada and 9 other countries actually collaborated together in discussions of what types of standards they would find are the common ground across all the different requirements for medical devices. And we're able to work with international standards to create ISO 1345 and have it mutually referenced in a number of jurisdictions. So this is a great example of where trade implications come into effect because if you're in that particular market and you're looking to expand, you know that investing in this type of certification, you're having that presumption of conformity at least partially there across many different jurisdictions. So these are types of examples and how it works. Of course, each country has a slightly different mechanism by which they leverage those types of standards. It's always very specific. It's not, one standard covers an entire act or an entire legislation. It has to be very specifically mapped. And it'll also then give you what has sort of the guideline of how close is it a part of specific types of requirements. It'll give you the presumption of conformity. Is it specifically to that full clause? It has to be very clearly indicated what the coverage is.
This goes, sorry, I don't know if Monique or Alyssa had anything to say or ask within that. No, okay. So the next question was, oh, sorry, you do?
I was just saying lots of nodding when she was mentioning the medical devices process, because I think that's a great example of how this works together. It's a really great example.
This goes into the next question I was going to ask. It's about interoperability for improved trade. Like, how do we kind of see this playing out, or do you think organizations will prioritize technical interoperability and seek out markets with interoperable regulations? Just curious what you guys think in general.
I think so. My first instinct is yes. I think like if we think about what the drivers are behind artificial intelligence, they're market-based incentives and market-based drivers. We're developing these products for efficiencies, for personalization, and so the goal is to get them out to market. I think that the thing that will be interesting to watch for is what do we consider to be um, amenable at market entry criteria. So I know historically folks have, the perception of the EU is that it's difficult because of all these rules, but I don't know if that's, and then Martha could probably speak to this better than I could, but on the flip side of that, we've also seen some positive change come out of having those those set of rules in place that define what a product entering the market needs to look like. So I think the positive example that I always like to use is like USB-C. Like, like that's a great example of of something changing. So I think that that's definitely the goal. I think in Canada the question will be how do we look at things like our trade systems and the levers that we do have around standards and interoperability and who's coming to the table and co-regulation to make sure that in sectors where we have prior like interest because of a past record in performance. So that might be something like natural resources. It might be something else. How do we see ourselves participating and leveraging the things that we know that we're good at to create market incentives and systems that we can collaborate in. And so even things like trade agreements, I think, are things that people should be watching right about now.
I also think it like when thinking about trade or kind of interoperability, it's important to not think about like perfect harmonization. Like I think that sometimes like let's not like lose movement for perfection. Like perfect harmonization is unlikely to exist. And so things like standards or like understanding how these things work together will be really important from a trade perspective. Like we can still have trading routes across the world where we ship goods, but we drive on opposite sides of the road. Like there doesn't necessarily have to be like perfect harmonization. I have a little widget that I put over my electrical pieces and I go to Europe. So I also think that it's important to kind of consider that there are many, many ways to work around this that we shouldn't be deterred by perhaps not perfect alignment.
I would also add, I think particularly for the EU, and I understand always the challenges of complexities, but I think Canada's in a unique position by having a free trade agreement with EU at the moment, and being able to leverage those types of mechanisms gives the space to create whatever the interim steps towards a reasonable understanding, mutual recognition as it's called, between the goods and services that flow. So I think there are definitely ways and mechanisms for trade to exist. And I think there will be a preference for interoperability just by the efficiency and convenience. And so I think there will be that sort of mindset of whether it's for frameworks that are applicable, whether it's for products and services that are sort of able to work together. I think that's going to be something that's going to make her like it's going to very much influence on how we see AI systems adopted. And particularly, as I mentioned before, how it's going to be adopted in existing industry verticals.
So I'm just going to ask a couple more questions and then we'll get to the audience Q&A because I'm cognizant we're getting towards the end. So the three of you all sort of mentioned different incentives and mechanisms throughout your presentations about how to gain consumer trust, whether that be through standards or certifications or assurance efforts or third-party audits or a number of others that exist. So what sort of incentives and mechanisms do you see working given the increasingly growing market size of this? And how do those things kind of work? And have you seen them work as intended, maybe in smaller markets or other markets in general?
I'll start. I don't have a perfect answer for this question. It's kind of
That's
tough.
okay. I don't think there is one.
The way
Sorry.
I look at it is like, what are the ingredients in my trust sandwich? And they're all important. And so I think that the market incentives right now are probably the most interesting. Like people are pretty concerned about brand and reputational trust and like legal fallout. Like I think it's also important to remind ourselves that there's still a bunch of law mechanisms in place that protect us, whether it's human rights law or labor law. So like there still is a lot of compliance that is happening to existing law. So people, that is helping. But I also think there's this like reputational risk, organizational risk piece that is having a lot of impact. You look at what happened with Air Canada and their chatbot, and then when I was working more within industry, there was a bunch of companies that were like, we're gonna pause our chatbot," and so I think that's one element of the trust sandwich. I think some of the things around evaluations, um, audits, however that can be defined, sometimes that's ambiguous. Certification standards are one layer. Regulation, if it exists as a layer, but then you see a lot of these sort of best practices or principles that are evolving out of like industry or context specific type things that are having a lot of impact. Monique mentioned some of the things around from legal societies. We're seeing a lot in health, and so it's not just one thing. And is it all working? Like I kind of think that tough to tell because adoption isn't actually in line with the hype. There is a lot of hype, but the amount of AI that's actually being adopted and deployed inside of organizations in our lives isn't matched. And so really tough to say like, is it working? But I would say that the overall kind of trust barometer would demonstrate that there's still a way to go in terms of generating more trust. Um, so yeah, it's a bit of spinning of dials. And kind of, we don't have the perfect answers yet. That's my initial take.
Monique, Marta, any thoughts?
I like the idea of like the trust sandwich. I think it's a perfect image,
Great.
and I think it's a great encompassing of how the right approach should be for sure. I like that.
I think the thing that Alyssa said that, and I kind of started my presentation with, is that we have just it's a number of places where all of these conversations will take place. And so I think that kind of really resonates with me. The idea that we still have things like consumer protections and recourse in those mechanisms means that in the event that all of the other things that we were working on, organizations trying to safeguard their reputations and doing their best to put trusted products into the market, means that like even if all of those things fail, there's still recourse. Um, I think the one thing that is actually interesting right now that I've observed is the front end part of that, is that even absent comprehensive regulation, organizations are trying to, I think, put their best foot forward and get this right. So things like guidance, having the right stakeholders at the table, like Alyssa said, actually pulling your tech when it's not performing the way that you expect, I think are all positive signals. I think that that it's a different dynamic than perhaps the way that in Canada we started our kind of foray into AI governance and regulation, but I don't think it's one that will necessarily like fail us. I love the adapter story, Alyssa, because you know what, more than that, you trust that little widget when you plug it in to work and not electrocute you, right? So I think there's a lot of things that we can point to that show how these systems have um, kept us safe and performed well, even when things are different. Electricity, telco, internet. I know folks argue that AI is not the same as those things, but I still say that, AI will be integrated into all of those things, and they're verticals that, to Marta's point, that are working well.
And if you just like go online and look at like the sheer volume of AI governance roles inside of organizations, like so yes, there's like a lot going on from a consulting perspective, but looking at like how many people are building out their governance teams, um, it's significant. So that is also a signal or a leading indicator for me that companies are investing in this, trying to get it right and like hiring talent. Um, to help like manage the AI inside of their organizations. And so kind of even looking at the number of startups and tooling providers that are coming into the space, because obviously there is a market demand, or at least a perception of it. So I think the amount of activity, the amount of hiring, the amount of investment in this space is also a really interesting signal that, well, in the absence of regulation, people still want to do the right thing, even if it is protect ourselves from risk. And I'll take it. Like, I'll take that for sure.
The last question before we go to the Q&A is, what role do you guys see as like government's role in interoperability efforts, private sector's role, academia or civil society's role? Like, how do you see these different players all sort of contributing to aim towards regulatory or technical interoperability?
So I'm going to shout out the Standards Council of Canada. I just want to say that Annika and her team are doing actually a really great job on this front. And so if folks are interested in what's happening in standards in Canada, Standards Council of Canada has a lot of great resources, and their team is really knowledgeable. They're at the table for many of these conversations that are happening. And they publish resources. They've also even developed an AI hub. And I think that's a really great resource to help folks understand the standards landscape and how that can be applied to their approaches to work. So that's my like first plug for just like good work is happening in Canada. The other thing that I will say is that there are like standards don't just happen in one way. So there are other groups and bodies that help to try to kind of develop guidance and inform best practices. So we see that even in Canada as well with other groups, even if you think about within the context of professional practice, colleges are providing guidance and self-regulation. So I think the answer is, you know, we don't come to a position on our normative expectations through one thing. Standards are one of the ways that we do that. Civil society can help, and researchers can help by helping us understand the technology, the problems, and ensuring that we're asking the right questions. Government can help by setting the right conditions for incentives and making it easier for companies to participate and or adopt these tools. And I think that just recognizing, I think it was either Marta or Alyssa, they listed like different types of standards framework. So it's not a single framework. There's NIST, there's ISO, there's all these other ones, and just recognizing IEEE that all of them within their context will have some role to play. So it's not the fun and exciting part of AI maybe for some folks, but I think it's an important part. And it's definitely a part of the ecosystem where everyone can participate.
I mean, I'm very happy to hear the AI Hub is still going strong at Standards Council Canada. It was my last project before departing that corporation, so it's nice to see the seeds have grown into a full-fledged initiative, I guess, at this point, and Annika's team has taken it on. So I'm very, very pleased to hear that that's still ongoing and growing. I think I'll speak to maybe the technological interoperability one aspect, and I mean, yes, there is obviously competitive market landscape, and there is a market stake to be won. But on the other hand, in this particular case of like AI adoption and maturation of technology, if there isn't a common industry understanding of best practices, there is very limited market. And in forums to standards development, it is a very different world, I guess, than maybe some may perceive, where yes, you're very big players, but all sizes really are coming to the table from an industry. So while yes, Microsoft participates in the development of standards, it's not alone. There are representation from all your sort of Oracle and AWS and others, and also Canadian startups, just Move AI, who's done an incredible work on the international scale for promoting frameworks and working to develop international standards. So the opportunity for us to have those technological discussions and understand where the innovation is going from each of our respective R&D and our respective perspectives, especially since we do work in slightly different areas. And so we provide slightly different products and services, is actually kind of how those conversations are able to ensure that the outgoing documents serve as that technological interoperability. But it also serves as a very sort like content-based, technology-based discussion, as opposed to about market acts, market competitive advantages, etc., marketing. It's a very different conversation, but a very necessary one that took place with the introduction of cloud and cloud computing almost a decade ago now. And we're seeing that type of forum being used again for AI.
And I'll just add like a slight thought around research, because I'm really thinking about foundational research, like cutting edge, like, the types of academia and the types of the academic research that is like thinking about the problems that we haven't even thought about yet, and have complete academic freedom and integrity to explore those problems that might not seem immediately tangible, that are super, super important. And so I think those types of things are really critical. But then I also think there's such a place for applied research where we actually have the known problem and that we need to solve, and then having that loop between industry and academia. So I think both have incredible merit and opportunity in terms of and need to be supported. And I'm also very keen to understand and kind of improve some of the feedback loop from academia to frontline use cases and deployment. There's so much incredible work happening and like cutting edge research that is making it down to real world use cases and applications, but even improving that further and making sure that that happens. And so I think it's important not to think of research or academia as one thing, and then to support kind of different streams and modes in which we get really important information for the problems we know and we're directionally close to solving, the problems we know and we don't know how to solve, and then the problems we haven't even considered yet. And so really parsing it or trifurcating it in that way and thinking about how we approach it from an academia perspective, it really interests me.
Thank you. So I'm going to start with the Q&A, or we'll go back to the Q&A now for the last 10 or so minutes of the webinar. So somebody asked, and this kind of goes to the cutting edge, well, it can go to the cutting edge research part, but it's often thought of as industry innovation rather than academic innovation. But somebody asked about the talking point about innovation versus regulation. How do you kind of strike a balance between the two? I hear this talking point brought up continuously, but I'm just curious what you guys think of it.
I think it's a bit of a false binary. I think that's it. Like it's being kind of poised as a binary, and in reality, it's a spectrum. There's good regulation, there's less good regulation. But like and maybe it's not innovation versus regulation, or maybe it's innovation versus guardrails, or even safety. Like I was told the other day I should change my title because safety is dead, and I was like, well, that shan't be happening. However, like I don't know where this false binary happened. I don't agree with it. I think that you can consider safety and consider guardrails and consider mechanisms while still, pragmatically accelerating. And so I disagree with the premise that that binary exists. But I understand that perception is reality as well. So that's important.
I would echo Alyssa's sentiment. I also feel like it's a bit of a false binary. I think that when folks think of regulation, they often go to hard law, punitive actions for non-compliance. And that's why when I started my presentation, I tried to focus on all the things. It's the institutions, it's the people, it's the standards, it's the rules. It's the guidance, it's the interventions that we're putting out there to incentivize behavior, and that could be something like direct investment, which is not necessarily punitive. So I think I think regulation is like almost like a Swiss Army knife. There's a lot of options in there. The one that we've just been focusing on over the last little while in Canada is how do we set out those hard punitive non-compliance types of systems. I mean, I shouldn't say focusing on because it's not the only one, but it's the one that's kind of been at the front of the conversation. And I just think that there's a lot in a regulatory toolkit that we should be considering and leveraging. And beyond that, I think we should be asking the tough questions around, okay, so how do we make sure that these structures can continue to be adaptive as our understanding of AI improves and increases as it's adopted into verticals. And so I think that's a really interesting question. How do we modernize something? How do we make it more agile? How do we make it adaptive? How do we get faster feedback, leveraging some of the other things that exist out there, to ensure that there is, safe and compliant adoption. It's also one of the reasons why I think regulatory markets is an interesting idea, because it helps to incentivize competition around how we develop, AI compliance mechanisms. So I think there's a lot of option out there. I think a lot to be pursued in terms of how we approach what's next for AI governance standards and interoperability.
I'd also add, so absolutely, I think there's it's very hard to realistically say whether it's binary. It's always going to be some sort of a spectrum, but it's also not necessarily two separate discussions. We've seen a number of regulators or policymakers want to engage with researchers and industry where innovation is happening, so they better understand uh, what exactly will be impactful in the frameworks that they develop. And I've seen conversely a lot of industry, particularly in the SME space, when I was still working as an advisor for their AI strategies, is the idea of understanding regulatory requirements and starting to bake them into the product development process a lot earlier than you would have maybe seen in other technological platforms that are being developed and deployed. So I think it's a lot more of a conversation between the two, and which will then inevitably result in some sort of a dot or a spot along that spectrum. But it's sort of not a separate, isolated variables that somehow produce a certain level of either leaning towards one end or the other. So I think continuing to have those conversations between regulators, policymakers, researchers, industry, large and small, I think that's how you get to that better understanding and that tightrope.
So this goes into one of the next questions. So somebody asked roughly, what are the mechanisms that can be used to sort of check compliance against all of these standards, rules, regulations, governance efforts? So I know we kind of brought them up, like third-party audits, assurance, certification, but how do these things actually like work? When you check compliance against them?
Sure, I can go
Sure,
first.
yeah.
It really depends. If it's a self-attestation, so a first-party declaration, it's as simple as being able to independently as an organization go through that checklist. And sometimes this is useful, especially when you're not looking to deploy like a full standard or a full audit. You're trying to guide yourself on your sort of a preparatory workup, or a place to start. It's a great one, and it helps to build your competencies towards it. If you're looking for a third party certification, so it's an independent audit, you have auditors that come in and come together. There's a preparatory process to get ready for an audit, and there's services available that help you consult your way through and better understand what it means to show evidence, to show documentation. How do you support saying, not as simple as saying, yes, I comply to this control, but actually being able to demonstrate it is a big part of it. Is also getting you into the mindset of regulatory compliance, because as at that point, it's whether, if a regulator comes in with an investigative inquiry, well, a big part of that is being able to prepare the documentation in support of the response that you're about to provide to that regulator. So there's different ways in which you can go about it depending on what your objective and outcome is. But each of them can kind of help you prepare for the next step up. And there's, of course, a number of different checklists available and a number of different consultancies that are sort of making their space in this area to help organizations navigate it, because it is complex and because it is also evolving. There are new frameworks coming about. There will be new audits available as certifiable standards become published. So there is a challenge of being able to keep up with what's available in the market, and then also be able to align your organizational practices with it. But there are incremental steps that one can take to, depending on the level of commitment that they're looking to take in terms of implementing those frameworks and standards.
I'll just add that you're also seeing a huge influx of tools to the market that are meant to support this, like support tracking the regulation, automating some of the requirements, helping you get all the documentation together, flagging areas in the life cycle that things might need to happen. So, AI governance tools, those types of things, testing tools are all coming to market as well. And there's a variety that do different things for different people. And so that is one way that people are basically using technology to help systematize and automate some of the governance pieces and to track, especially in huge organizations where your AI inventory might have thousands of AI systems.
And just on that point, I'd actually say Canada is actually one of the places where we're actually seeing a lot of those reg tech type companies crop up. So I was at the Canadian Reg Tech Association Awards, I think like last year, and I was surprised at the number of Canadian companies that are in this space. So I think Alyssa's right on about saying there's an increasing number of tools across that are companies and tools that are emerging to help people navigate the landscape. And maybe it's one of the places where Canada can even help to lead globally.
Yeah, we're going to take one last question before I wrap up. So what are sort of the risks of letting standards maybe pick up the slack in terms of driving these norms or principles or rules in favor of regulation or legislation or maybe state-backed rules? Like, is there any inherent risks in this process of relying on these sorts of mechanisms rather than hard law? If so, what might they be?
I think so. They serve. Oh, sorry. Well, I was going to say they serve very different purposes. And so the challenge there is trying to, substitute a square for a circle. And we see that with the current standards being developed, there are stakeholders that feel like this is an opportunity in the absence of regulation to write standards as if you were to be writing legal acts. And it's a different type of language. If you've had the opportunity to read a standard or read a regulatory act, they serve a different function. One is complementary and can serve as a mechanism for implementation of the other, but it's not going to substitute or provide the same groundwork, standards as regulation. And so, the concern that we sometimes see right now in the standards landscape is trying to create regulatory text within standards. And it's a challenge because there's clearly a need for stringent frameworks, and there is parts of AI deployment which there is a clear need for regulation, particularly from a safety perspective. But in the absence of regulation, standards aren't going to fill the gap of regulations because that's just simply not their design.
I think we're just pointing to standards right now because it is helping with interoperability and it's the mechanisms we had. And so I think, yeah, probably I agree with Marta. It's unlikely that we're not saying standards are replacing regulation. It's one part of the sandwich.
In the last point I'll add, just because we seem to be all aligned on this point that they're two different things with two different functions, is the opportunity, is that question around what you get with like hard law is, you get like the sanctions are different. As Marta pointed out, you're talking about, fines or imprisonment, loss of license. So they're very and I guess that can happen with certification, loss of certification, which looks different. But they're very like prescriptive. And the other thing I would say is that I think, even though I've said like we've got all these existing laws that cover us, I think the question is, um, you know, and this is part of the process, is making sure that they are always robust enough that that we continue to modernize them. And that when there are gaps, we do introduce laws that help to cover us, I think. But absent comprehensive AI, I think we have to rely on the laws that we have and the institutions that we have, our courts, our judges, our lawyers, to help us, kind of navigate, any sort of issues that happen at the end of the AI pipeline, once products hit consumers in the market.
Okay, are there any other final thoughts before I wrap up?
I do want to just address this
Yeah.
one last comment.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So there was a comment in the chat. It's about massive AI infrastructure investments in states and keeping talent in Canada. And what I will say is two things is, developing talent is a long pipeline. So if the government's concerned about that, or if companies are concerned about having the right talent in Canada so that we can remain competitive, I would say things like, yeah, ensuring that PhD students have a livable wage is one of the ways that we can do that, making sure that there's enough research funding available for folks that are studying in these areas, because it's a long talent pipeline. The other thing I would say, just in a short plug for SMEs, is ensuring that there are incentives and supports for them to be able to participate and adopt in AI tools and participate in the AI economy. If we're going to be introducing things like audits and all these compliance mechanisms, like what cost to these companies. So just making sure we have the right incentives to make sure that we have people who can build things and companies that participate. We will never be able to compare to the United States in terms of investment. We're just not as big in size, and we all know that. But I think that if we're concerned about it, we need consistent investment in people and Canadian companies.
And safe and secure access to important and interesting data sets. But Monique, +1, so good.
Wrap up. So thank you to the three of you for your presentations, discussions, insights, to Google.org for supporting this project, my CEIMIA colleagues on the call who helped organize the webinar, and to all of you guys for taking the time out of your day to attend this webinar. Thank you. And please note that there is going to be 2 subsequent webinars on this topic as our project work develops over the next 8 months. So stay tuned to CEIMIA's social media for information on those upcoming webinars, and we hope to see you there. We will also share the recording of this discussion to our social media pages for you to visit. You can find out more information on the project page. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day and week.